Sarah Martinez learned to fight before she learned to read properly. Growing up in the tough neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, she discovered early that being small meant being a target. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely 90 pounds, she looked like an easy mark for the bullies who ruled the streets around her apartment complex. Her father, Miguel Martinez, worked double shifts at a textile factory while her mother, Rosa, cleaned office buildings at night. Money was always tight in the Martinez household. Sarah wore hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit right, and her lunch often consisted of whatever she could scrape together from the kitchen before school. But despite their struggles, Miguel had instilled one crucial lesson in his daughter from a very young age. Mija, he would tell her every morning before work, the world will try to make you small. Don't let it. Fight for your place, fight for your dreams, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. Sarah took those words to heart, but she interpreted them literally. By the time she was 12, she had gotten into more schoolyard fights than most kids get into arguments. Teachers called her parents constantly, frustrated by her apparent inability to walk away from confrontation. What they didn't understand was that Sarah wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble was looking for her. The first time someone underestimated Sarah Martinez was in 7th grade. Tommy Rodriguez was 15, held back twice, and used his size to intimidate younger students. He had been picking on Sarah's younger brother, Carlos, for weeks, taking his lunch money and shoving him around after school. Sarah had warned Tommy to stop when he laughed in her face and shoved Carlos hard enough to send him sprawling. Sarah decided warnings were over. The fight lasted less than a minute. Tommy outweighed Sarah by at least 40 pounds, but she was faster, angrier, and far more determined. She used his size against him, ducking under his wild swings and landing precise punches to his ribs and stomach. When Tommy doubled over, gasping for air, Sarah grabbed his head and brought her knee up hard. The impact sent him backward onto the concrete, nose bleeding, ego shattered. Word spread quickly through the school. The tiny Martinez girl had dropped one of the biggest bullies in 7th grade. Some kids were impressed, others were terrified, but everyone learned an important lesson that day. Size doesn't always determine the outcome of a fight. Sarah's parents were called to school the next day. Miguel sat across from the principal, Mrs. Henderson, listening as she explained that Sarah was facing suspension for fighting. Rosa twisted her hands nervously in her lap, worried about what this meant for their daughter's future. But Miguel surprised them both with his response. "Did this boy hurt my son first?" he asked calmly. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but that doesn't justify violence. Sarah should have come to a teacher or administrator." Miguel leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Henderson, with respect, my daughter protected her family when the adults failed to do so. Where I come from, that's not a character flaw. That's character." The suspension was reduced to 3 days, but the incident marked a turning point for Sarah. She began to see her fighting ability not as a problem to be controlled, but as a skill to be developed. Her uncle Roberto, who had boxed professionally in Mexico before an injury ended his career, noticed Sarah's natural talent and offered to train her properly. Roberto's garage became Sarah's second home. Every afternoon after school, she would change into worn-out athletic clothes and spend hours learning proper technique. Roberto was a tough teacher who demanded perfection in every movement. He taught her that fighting was as much about discipline and control as it was about aggression. "Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry," Roberto would tell her as she worked the heavy bag. "But a real fighter knows when to throw it, where to throw it, and how to throw it for maximum effect. Anger makes you sloppy. Discipline makes you dangerous." Sarah absorbed every lesson like a sponge. She learned footwork, head movement, and how to generate power from her entire body despite her small frame. More importantly, she learned patience and timing. Roberto taught her to watch her opponent, to identify weaknesses, and to wait for the perfect moment to strike. By the time she entered high school, Sarah had developed a reputation that preceded her. She wasn't a tiny, helpless girl anymore. She was still small, but there was something different about the way she carried herself. Confidence radiated from every step, and smart kids learned quickly not to mistake her size for weakness. The high school years brought new challenges. Sarah excelled academically, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at a local grocery store to help her family with bills. She had dreams of college, but the financial reality made it seem impossible. Her guidance counselor, Mr. Peterson, suggested she look into military service as a way to pay for her education. At first, Sarah dismissed the idea. She had never thought of herself as military material. But the more she researched, the more appealing it became. The military would give her the chance to serve her country, pay for college, and prove herself on a larger stage than the streets of East LA. When she announced her intention to enlist, the reactions were mixed. Her parents were proud, but worried. Her friends thought she was crazy. Her uncle Roberto was the most supportive, recognizing that military training would take her natural fighting abilities to the next level. "The military will teach you things I can't," he told her during one of their last training sessions. "But remember what you learned here. Size doesn't matter if you have heart, technique, and the will to win." Sarah's senior year of high school was focused entirely on preparing for military life. She increased her training intensity, running miles every morning before school and spending hours in Roberto's garage working on her skills. She studied military history, learned about different branches of service, and ultimately decided on the Marines. The decision surprised many people who knew her. The Marines had a reputation as the toughest, most demanding branch of the military. They were known for their rigorous training and high standards. Some people questioned whether a small girl from East LA could handle that level of intensity. Sarah's response was simple: "Let them doubt me. I've been proving people wrong my whole life." The day she signed her enlistment papers, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was 18 years old, about to embark on the biggest challenge of her life. Her recruiter, Staff Sergeant Johnson, looked at her small frame with barely concealed skepticism. "Are you sure about this, Martinez?" he asked. "Boot camp is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. A lot of bigger, stronger recruits don't make it through." Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. "Staff Sergeant, I've been fighting my whole life. I'm not planning to stop now." The months leading up to her departure for boot camp flew by. Sarah continued her training with Roberto, but now with a specific focus on preparing for military standards. She worked on her endurance, her upper body strength, and her mental toughness. Roberto pushed her harder than ever before, knowing that she would need every advantage she could get. On the night before leaving for Paris Island, Sarah sat with her family around the small kitchen table. Her parents looked proud, but worried. Her brother Carlos looked up to her with admiration, and the weight of their expectations settled on her shoulders. "Promise me something, Mija," her father said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, you won't let them break your spirit. You are strong in ways they won't understand until you show them." Sarah reached across the table and took her father's weathered hand. "Y promise, Papa. I'm going to make you proud." As she lay in bed that final night, staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the scared little girl who learned to fight on the playground to the confident young woman about to enter Marine Corps training, she had come a long way. But she knew the real test was still ahead. Tomorrow, she would board a bus that would take her away from everything familiar and thrust her into a world designed to push her beyond her limits. She would face drill instructors who wouldn't care about her background or her determination. She would be surrounded by recruits who would likely see her as weak, small, and out of place. But Sarah Martinez had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. As sleep finally took her, her last conscious thought was a promise to herself. She would show them all what a fighter from East LA could do. The bus pulled into Paris Island Marine Corps Recruit Depot at 3:47 in the morning, its headlights cutting through the humid South Carolina darkness. Sarah pressed her face against the window, trying to get her first glimpse of the place that would either make her or break her over the next 13 weeks. The other recruits around her were mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Sarah had tried to prepare herself mentally for this moment, but nothing could have readied her for the reality that was about to unfold. The bus doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and immediately the night exploded into chaos. "Get off my bus! Move! Move! Move!" The voice belonged to Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Williams, a mountain of a man who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. He was followed by two other drill instructors, their smoky bear hats perfectly positioned, their uniforms crisp despite the early hour. Sarah had never heard anyone yell that loud or with that much authority. The recruits stumbled off the bus in a confused mass, trying to grab their bags while processing the barrage of commands being shouted at them from multiple directions. Sarah was near the back of the group, and by the time she stepped onto the asphalt, the drill instructors had already identified several recruits to single out for special attention. "You there, the skinny one in the back." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized Staff Sergeant Williams was pointing directly at her. She had been on the island for less than 2 minutes and was already on a drill instructor's radar. "Yes, sir," she shouted back, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Williams strode over to her, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow her whole. He was at least 6 feet 4 inches and probably weighed 250 pounds of solid muscle. Standing in front of him, Sarah felt smaller than she ever had in her life. "What's your name, recruit?" "Sarah Martinez, sir." Williams circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Martinez? Let me guess, you think you're tough because you're from the streets, right? You think growing up in the hood prepared you for this place." Sarah's jaw clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "No excuse, sir. I'm here to earn the title, sir." "Earn the title?" Williams laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You weigh what, 90 pounds soaking wet? You look like a strong breeze would knock you over. What makes you think you belong here with real Marines?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could feel every other recruit watching this interaction. Some of them were probably relieved that they weren't the ones being singled out. Others were likely making mental notes about the small girl who was already drawing negative attention. "Sir, this recruit believes that heart matters more than size, sir." William stopped directly in front of her, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. Heart doesn't carry a wounded Marine to safety. Heart doesn't complete a 20-mile forced march with full gear. Heart is worthless without the physical ability to back it up." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir. This recruit understands, sir." "We'll see about that, Martinez. We'll see about that." The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, and the complete stripping away of everything that had identified Sarah as an individual. Her head was shaved, her civilian clothes were taken away, and she was issued the same uniform as every other recruit. For the first time in her life, she looked in a mirror and didn't recognize herself. The transformation was jarring, but also oddly liberating. Gone were the hand-me-down clothes that marked her as poor. Gone was the long hair she had always hidden behind when feeling insecure. What remained was just Sarah, stripped down to her essence, ready to prove what she was really made of. The first week of training was designed to shock recruits into the Marine Corps mindset, and it succeeded beyond Sarah's expectations. The days began at 4:30 a.m. with aggressive wake-up calls and didn't end until lights out at 2100 hours. Every minute in between was filled with physical training, drill instruction, classes, and constant evaluation. Sarah quickly realized that her biggest challenge wouldn't be the physical demands. Her years of training with Uncle Roberto had prepared her body reasonably well. Her biggest challenge would be earning the respect of her fellow recruits and proving to the drill instructors that she belonged. The other recruits came from all walks of life, but most of them were bigger and stronger than Sarah. There was Jackson, a former high school football player from Texas who stood 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds. There was Rodriguez, no relation to the Tommy she had fought in 7th grade. A construction worker from Colorado with arms like tree trunks. There was Thompson, who had grown up on a farm and could probably lift a truck if he needed to. And then there was Sarah, still barely 90 pounds despite months of preparation, still looking like she might blow away in a strong wind. The whispered comments started on day 2. Sarah heard them during chow time, during gear cleaning, during the brief moments when the drill instructors weren't actively watching every move the recruits made. "What's a little girl like that doing here? She's going to wash out in the first week. I give her 3 days before she's crying to go home. She's going to get someone hurt when she can't keep up. Sarah said nothing, but she listened to every word. Each comment was fuel for the fire that burned inside her. She had heard it all before, and she had proven doubters wrong before. The venue had changed, but the challenge was fundamentally the same. The first real test came during physical training on day 4. The recruits were introduced to the Marine Corps physical fitness test standards, including pull-ups, crunches, and a 3-mile run. Sarah watched as the bigger recruits knocked out set after set of pull-ups with relative ease. Jackson managed 15 without breaking a sweat. Rodriguez hit 12 and looked like he could do more. Thompson, despite his farm boy build, surprised everyone by cranking out 18 perfect pull-ups. When it was Sarah's turn, the entire platoon watched. She approached the pull-up bar with her heart pounding, knowing that this moment would likely define how her fellow recruits viewed her for the remainder of training. She jumped up and grabbed the bar, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. The first pull-up was smooth, her chin clearing the bar easily. The second was just as clean. By the 5th pull-up, some recruits were starting to look impressed. By the 10th, they were openly surprised. Sarah kept going. 15, 16, 17. Her arms were burning now, but she could feel the eyes of everyone in the platoon on her. This was her moment to make a statement. 18, 19, 20. She dropped from the bar and landed lightly on her feet, breathing hard but not exhausted. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had greeted her arrival on the island. This was the silence of respect being earned. Staff Sergeant Williams had watched the entire performance without expression, but Sarah caught something in his eyes that might have been approval. Or maybe she was imagining it. The crunches were even easier. Sarah's small frame was all muscle and no excess weight, and her core strength was exceptional thanks to years of training. She completed the maximum number required and could have kept going, but it was the 3-mile run that really silenced her critics. Sarah had been running the streets of East LA since she was 12 years old, often covering much longer distances as part of her training with Roberto. The pace set by the drill instructors was challenging, but manageable for her. What surprised everyone was how she handled the formation running. The platoon ran together, maintaining the same pace, and traditionally the smaller recruits struggled to keep up with the longer strides of their larger counterparts. Sarah not only kept pace, but actually had to hold back to avoid pulling ahead of the formation. As they crossed the finish line, Sarah noticed that several recruits were looking at her with something approaching respect. She had passed the first test, but she knew it was only the beginning. That evening, during the brief personal time allowed before lights out, Jackson approached her as she was writing a letter home to her parents. "Hey, Martinez," he said, his Texas drawl softened with what sounded like genuine respect. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were going to be a liability to the platoon. I was wrong." Sarah looked up from her letter. "Thanks, Jackson, but I'm not done proving myself yet." "Maybe not," he said with a grin, "but you're off to a hell of a start." Word of Sarah's performance spread beyond her platoon. Other drill instructors began taking notice of the tiny recruit who was keeping pace with much larger Marines-to-be. Some seemed impressed. Others seemed skeptical, as if they were waiting for her to fail spectacularly. The academic portions of training presented their own challenges, but Sarah excelled there as well. Her high school grades had been excellent, and she absorbed information about Marine Corps history, military tactics, and weapons systems with ease. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for map reading and land navigation, skills that would prove valuable in later phases of training. But it was during weapons training that Sarah really began to shine. The M16 rifle felt natural in her hands, and her marksmanship scores were among the highest in the platoon. Her small frame, which had been viewed as a liability in other areas, actually worked to her advantage when it came to shooting. She was stable, focused, and had excellent natural hand-eye coordination. Staff Sergeant Williams began paying closer attention to Sarah's progress. During one particularly challenging day of combat training, he pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Martinez, I'll admit that when you first arrived, I didn't think you'd make it through the first week. Hell, I didn't think you'd make it through the first day. But you surprised me." Sarah stood at attention, unsure if this was a compliment or setup for criticism. However, Williams continued, "The real tests are still ahead. Boot camp gets harder from here, not easier. The physical demands increase, the stress increases, and the pressure to quit becomes overwhelming. A lot of recruits who start strong don't finish." "Yes, sir. This recruit understands, sir." Williams studied her for a long moment. "There's going to come a time, Martinez, when being tough isn't going to be enough. We're going to need to dig deeper than you've ever dug before. When that time comes, remember why you're here. Remember what you're fighting for." As the first month of training drew to a close, Sarah felt like she was hitting her stride. She had earned the respect of most of her fellow recruits. Her performance in all areas was solid, and she was beginning to feel like she truly belonged. But she also knew that Williams was right. The hardest challenges were still ahead, and somewhere in the weeks to come, she would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She would need every ounce of strength, determination, and fighting spirit she had developed over her 18 years. The scared little girl from East LA was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever. But the real question remained. Was she strong enough to survive what was coming next? Week 6 of Marine Corps boot camp arrived like a sledgehammer to the gut. The drill instructors had warned the recruits that the middle phase of training would separate those who truly wanted to be Marines from those who were just playing soldier. Sarah was about to discover exactly what they meant. The morning started like any other, with the familiar sound of drill instructors storming through the squad bay at precisely 4:30 a.m., banging on trash cans and shouting wake-up commands. But something felt different in the air. There was an electricity, a tension that hadn't been there the day before. "Listen up, maggots!" Staff Sergeant Williams bellowed as the recruits scrambled to form up in their underwear, feet at the position of attention. "Today begins the most important week of your pathetic little lives. Today, you start proving whether you have what it takes to earn the title Marine or whether you're just wasting everyone's time." Sarah stood in formation, her heart pounding with anticipation. Over the past 6 weeks, she had consistently performed at or near the top of her platoon in most areas. Her physical fitness scores were excellent, her marksmanship was outstanding, and her academic performance was flawless. She had earned the grudging respect of her drill instructors and the genuine friendship of most of her fellow recruits. But she could sense that all of that was about to be tested in ways she hadn't experienced yet. The first indication that this week would be different came during morning physical training. Instead of the usual routine of pull-ups, push-ups, and running, the recruits were marched to an area of the base they had never seen before. It looked like an obstacle course designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor and an unlimited budget for creating misery. "Welcome to the confidence course," announced drill instructor Sergeant Martinez, no relation to Sarah, despite sharing the same last name. "This course is designed to test every aspect of your physical and mental capabilities. Some of you will succeed, some of you will fail, and some of you will quit." The course was a series of increasingly challenging obstacles that required not just strength and endurance, but courage, coordination, and mental toughness. There were rope climbs, wall scaling, log carrying, and obstacles that seemed designed specifically to exploit fear of heights or confined spaces. Sarah watched as the first few recruits tackled the course. Jackson, with his football background, powered through most obstacles with brute force, but struggled with anything requiring finesse or technique. Rodriguez's construction work had given him excellent upper body strength, but his bulk worked against him on obstacles requiring agility. Thompson surprised everyone by moving through the course like he had been born to it, his farm background having given him a natural athleticism that translated perfectly to military obstacles. When Sarah's turn came, a small crowd had gathered to watch. Word had spread among the drill instructors about the tiny recruit who was exceeding all expectations, and several of them wanted to see how she would handle the most challenging physical test of boot camp so far. Sarah approached the first obstacle, a 15-foot rope climb, with confidence born from years of training with Uncle Roberto. She had spent countless hours climbing ropes in his garage, and the technique was second nature to her. She wrapped her legs around the rope, used her core strength to power upward, and reached the top in seconds. The next obstacle was a wall that stood 12 feet high with minimal handholds. Sarah watched other recruits struggle with it, using pure upper body strength to pull themselves up. She took a different approach, using her momentum and foot placement to essentially run up the wall, barely needing her arms at all. One by one, she conquered each obstacle with a combination of technique, determination, and intelligence. Where other recruits relied on strength, Sarah relied on skill. Where they used power, she used precision. But it was the final obstacle that would prove to be her greatest challenge yet. The Stairway to Hell was a 50-foot tall structure that required recruits to climb a series of increasingly narrow and unstable platforms. The final platform was barely 2 feet wide, and recruits had to cross a 10-foot gap using nothing but a thin rope while 50 feet in the air. Sarah had no particular fear of heights, but as she climbed higher and higher, she could feel the structure swaying slightly in the wind. The other recruits on the ground looked like tiny figures below, and she found herself gripping each handhold tighter than necessary. The first few platforms were manageable, but as she reached the higher levels, Sarah discovered something she hadn't expected: doubt. For the first time since arriving at Paris Island, she found herself questioning whether she was capable of completing a task. The rope stretched across the gap, looking impossibly thin and inadequate to support her weight. Other recruits had crossed it successfully, but they were bigger and stronger than her. What if her grip wasn't strong enough? What if she fell? Below her, she could hear the drill instructors shouting encouragement and commands, but their voices seemed to come from another world. She was alone on that platform, facing a challenge that was as much mental as it was physical. Sarah closed her eyes and heard her Uncle Roberto's voice from years of training. Fear is just another opponent, Mija. You don't run from opponents. You face them, you understand them, and you defeat them. She opened her eyes, gripped the rope with both hands, and swung out over the gap. For a terrifying moment, she was suspended 50 feet above the ground with nothing but her grip strength keeping her alive. Then her feet found the platform on the other side, and she was safe. The cheers from below were unlike anything she had heard during her time at boot camp. Even some of the drill instructors were clapping, though they tried to hide it. Sarah had not just completed the obstacle course. She had done it faster and more efficiently than most recruits twice her size. But the real test was still coming. That afternoon, the platoon was introduced to Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, MCMAP, the hand-to-hand combat system used by Marines. Sarah had been looking forward to this training since her arrival, knowing that her years of training with Uncle Roberto had prepared her well for this moment. The initial instruction covered basic techniques: punches, kicks, blocks, and takedowns. Sarah absorbed every detail, recognizing similarities to what Roberto had taught her, but also noting the differences in philosophy and approach. Marine Corps martial arts was less about finesse and more about efficiency. It was designed to disable an opponent quickly and move on to the next threat. During the demonstration phase, Sarah's technique was flawless. Her punches were crisp, her kicks were precise, and her footwork was textbook perfect. The instructors began using her as an example for other recruits to follow, which made her proud but also put a target on her back. It was during the sparring portion of the class that everything changed. The recruits were paired up for controlled sparring matches, practicing the techniques they had just learned. Sarah was paired with Davis, a recruit from Ohio who stood about 6 feet tall and outweighed her by at least 60 pounds. Davis was a decent guy who had never given Sarah any trouble, but she could see in his eyes that he wasn't taking her seriously as an opponent. "Take it easy on me, Martinez," he said with a grin as they faced each other on the mat. "I don't want to hurt you." The comment stung more than Sarah cared to admit. After 6 weeks of proving herself in every possible way, there were still people who saw her as fragile, as someone who needed to be protected rather than respected. "Don't worry about me, Davis," she replied, settling into her fighting stance. "Worry about yourself." The instructor called for them to begin, and Davis approached her casually, clearly expecting an easy victory. He threw a lazy jab that Sarah easily slipped, countering with a quick combination to his ribs. The shots landed cleanly, causing Davis to grunt in surprise and take a step back. His attitude changed immediately. The casual grin disappeared, replaced by focus and a hint of embarrassment. He had just been hit hard by someone half his size, and everyone in the class had seen it. Davis came forward more aggressively this time, throwing a series of punches designed to overwhelm Sarah with his reach and power advantage. But Sarah had been dealing with bigger opponents her entire life, and she knew exactly how to handle this situation. She moved like water, slipping and sliding around Davis's attacks while landing sharp counters whenever he overextended. Her punches might not have carried the same power as his, but they were landing with accuracy and frequency that was beginning to add up. The other recruits had stopped their own sparring to watch this match. Even the instructors were paying close attention, recognizing that they were witnessing something special. Davis, growing frustrated by his inability to land a clean shot, threw a wild haymaker that left him completely off balance. Sarah ducked under the punch, stepped behind him, and swept his legs. Davis crashed to the mat hard, with Sarah standing over him in a dominant position. The match was stopped immediately, with Sarah being declared the winner. But instead of celebration, Sarah noticed something troubling in the expressions of her fellow recruits. Some looked impressed, others looked embarrassed on Davis's behalf, and a few looked angry. After the class ended, Sarah overheard a conversation between several recruits that made her stomach drop. "Did you see that?" Rodriguez was saying to a group of other recruits. "She embarrassed Davis in front of everyone." "Yeah, that was unnecessary," agreed Thompson. "Davis was going easy on her, and she took advantage of it. She's trying to prove she's tough by beating up guys who are holding back," added another recruit whose name Sarah didn't know. "That's not courage, that's cheap shots." Sarah felt her face burning with anger and hurt. She hadn't asked Davis to go easy on her. She hadn't asked for special treatment. All she had done was defend herself and fight to win, the same way she had been doing her entire life. But apparently, when a small woman defeated a larger man, it wasn't seen as skill or determination. It was seen as taking advantage, as somehow cheating. The isolation started that evening. Conversations would stop when Sarah approached. Recruits who had been friendly before became distant and cool. Even Jackson, who had been one of her strongest supporters, seemed uncomfortable around her. The worst part was that Sarah couldn't figure out what she had done wrong. She had trained hard, followed all the rules, and performed to the best of her ability. But somehow, being successful had turned her into a pariah. The situation came to a head 3 days later during another MCMAP session. This time, instead of controlled sparring, the recruits were going to engage in more realistic combat scenarios. The instructors explained that this would simulate the kind of hand-to-hand fighting they might encounter in real combat situations. Sarah was paired with Rodriguez for the first scenario. As they faced each other on the mat, she could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just training anymore. This was personal. "Let's see how tough you really are, Martinez," Rodriguez said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. "No more going easy on you." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that the other recruits had convinced themselves that their previous losses to her had been because they were holding back, not because she was actually skilled. They saw this as an opportunity to put her in her place. The instructor called for the scenario to begin, and Rodriguez came at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. His punches were harder, his movements more aggressive, and his intent was clearly to hurt rather than just defeat. Sarah found herself in the most difficult fight of her Marine Corps experience. Rodriguez was bigger, stronger, and now he was fighting without restraint. She had to use every technique Roberto had ever taught her just to survive, let alone win. The fight went on longer than any previous match, with both combatants landing significant shots. Sarah's lip was split, her ribs were aching, and she could taste blood in her mouth. But she was also landing her own shots, using Rodriguez's aggression against him, and finding openings when he overcommit to his attacks. Finally, Sarah saw her opportunity. Rodriguez, frustrated by his inability to finish the fight quickly, threw a combination that left him slightly off balance. Sarah stepped inside his guard, grabbed him around the waist, and used a technique Roberto had drilled into her countless times. She lifted Rodriguez off his feet and slammed him to the ground with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The match was over, but as Sarah stood over Rodriguez's gasping form, she realized that she had won the battle but might have lost the war. The looks she was getting from her fellow recruits weren't just unfriendly anymore. They were hostile. That night, as Sarah lay in her rack nursing her injuries and thinking about the events of the day, she realized that her biggest challenge at Marine Corps boot camp wasn't going to be the physical demands or the mental pressure. It was going to be proving that she belonged there without making enemies of everyone around her. The tension in Platoon 2156 had become so thick you could cut it with a knife. Sarah Martinez found herself eating alone, training alone, and sleeping in a bunk surrounded by hostile silence. 3 weeks had passed since her decisive victory over Rodriguez, and instead of earning respect, it seemed to have made her more enemies than she knew what to do with. The other recruits had developed an unspoken code when it came to Sarah. They would follow orders and maintain military discipline, but beyond that, she was treated like she had some kind of contagious disease. Conversations stopped when she approached. Training partners were reluctant and resentful. Even simple requests for assistance with gear cleaning or bunk inspections were met with cold shoulders and minimal cooperation. Staff Sergeant Williams watched this dynamic develop with growing concern. He had seen platoons split apart by personality conflicts before, and it never ended well. A Marine unit that couldn't function as a team was a liability in training and potentially deadly in combat. Something needed to be done, but he wasn't sure what. The situation reached a breaking point during Week 9 of training, when the platoon was scheduled to participate in an advanced combat exercise. The scenario involved a simulated enemy attack on their position, followed by a counterattack that required perfect coordination and trust between team members. Sarah was assigned to a fire team with Rodriguez, Thompson, and a recruit named Kelly from Michigan. From the moment they were grouped together, Sarah could feel the resistance. Rodriguez barely acknowledged her existence. Thompson made it clear he thought she would be a liability, and Kelly seemed nervous about the whole situation. During the planning phase of the exercise, Sarah attempted to contribute tactical suggestions based on her excellent performance in map reading and strategy classes. Her ideas were solid, based on sound military principles, and would have given their team significant advantages in the scenario. "I think we should approach from the eastern ridge," she said, pointing to her map. "The terrain gives us better cover, and we can use the tree line to mask our movement until we're within effective range." Rodriguez glanced at her map dismissively. "That route takes too long. We should go straight up the middle and overwhelm them with speed." "That exposes us to enemy fire for too long," Sarah replied, keeping her voice professional. "The eastern approach gives us—" "Nobody asked you, Martinez," Thompson interrupted. "Rodriguez has the right idea. We go in fast and hard." Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't about her ego or her feelings. This was about completing the mission successfully and safely. But it was clear that her teammates had already decided to ignore any input she might offer. The exercise began at dawn, with Sarah's fire team tasked with eliminating an enemy machine gun position that was providing cover for the main enemy force. Rodriguez's plan was exactly what he had suggested during planning: a frontal assault that relied on speed and aggression rather than tactics or stealth. Sarah followed her teammates as they moved across open ground toward the enemy position, her heart pounding with anxiety. She could see immediately that this approach was going to fail. The enemy position had clear fields of fire across the terrain they were crossing, and they would be exposed to defensive fire for far too long. Sure enough, when they were still 200 yards from their objective, the simulated enemy fire began. In a real combat situation, Sarah's entire team would have been cut down before they got within effective range of their target. The exercise ended with their mission marked as a complete failure. During the after-action review, the instructor was brutal in his assessment of their performance. "That was one of the worst tactical approaches I've seen from any team this training cycle," he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "You ignored basic principles of cover and concealment. You failed to use terrain to your advantage, and you walked straight into a kill zone like tourists at a shooting gallery. Rodriguez's face was red with embarrassment and anger. Thompson stared at the ground. Kelly looked like he wanted to disappear. And Sarah felt responsible for their failure, even though her suggestions had been ignored. After the instructor dismissed them, Rodriguez turned on Sarah with fury in his eyes. "This is your fault," he hissed. "Your plan would have taken too long and gotten us all killed." "My plan would have worked," Sarah replied calmly. "Your plan got us killed before we even got close to the objective. You think you know everything, don't you?" Thompson joined in. "You think because you can beat up a few guys in sparring that you're some kind of tactical genius." Sarah felt something snap inside her. Weeks of isolation, hostility, and having her contributions dismissed had finally pushed her past her breaking point. "You know what?" she said, her voice rising. "You're right. I do think I know more than you. I think I'm a better Marine than any of you. And I think the only reason you can't stand me is because you can't accept that someone half your size is outperforming you in every single area that matters." The confrontation attracted the attention of other recruits and, unfortunately, Staff Sergeant Williams. He approached the group with the expression of a man who was about to solve a problem permanently. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Sir, just a disagreement about tactics, sir," Rodriguez replied, trying to minimize the situation. Williams looked at each of them in turn, his experienced eyes reading the tension and hostility that had been building for weeks. "Martinez, walk with me." Sarah followed the drill instructor away from the group, her heart hammering in her chest. She was sure she was about to be disciplined for the confrontation, possibly even removed from training. Instead, William surprised her with his first question. "How long has this been going on?" "Sir, this recruit doesn't understand the question, sir." William stopped walking and turned to face her. "Cut the formal crap for a minute, Martinez. I'm asking you as one warrior to another. How long have your fellow recruits been treating you like an outcast?" Sarah hesitated, unsure if this was a test or a genuine question. Finally, she decided on honesty. "Since the sparring incident with Davis, sir, maybe 3 weeks. And why do you think that is?" "Sir, this recruit believes they see her success as a threat to their own self-image, sir." Williams nodded slowly. "That's exactly right. And it's creating a problem that goes beyond hurt feelings. A Marine unit that can't function as a team is useless to the core and dangerous to itself. Something needs to change, and it needs to change today." "Sir, yes, sir. Here's what's going to happen, Martinez. Tonight, after evening chow, you're going to have the opportunity to settle this once and for all. I'm arranging a special training session that will either solve this problem or make it clear who doesn't belong in my platoon." Sarah felt a chill of anticipation mixed with dread. "Sir, what kind of training session, sir?" William smiled, but it wasn't a particularly comforting expression. "You'll see. Just be ready to prove everything you've been claiming about yourself." That evening, after the regular training day had ended, Williams assembled the entire platoon in the gymnasium. Sarah noticed that several other drill instructors were present, along with a few officers she didn't recognize. Whatever was about to happen, it was being taken seriously by the chain of command. "Listen up," Williams commanded as the recruits formed up in their physical training uniforms. "We have a problem in this platoon. Some of you seem to think that one of your fellow recruits doesn't belong here. Some of you think she's weak, that she's a liability, that she's only succeeded so far because you've been going easy on her." The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. Every recruit knew exactly who Williams was talking about. "Well, tonight we're going to settle this question permanently. Recruit Martinez has volunteered to demonstrate her capabilities against any and all challengers. The rules are simple. Full contact sparring, no time limits. Matches continue until one participant cannot continue or submits." Sarah's eyes widened. This wasn't what she had expected at all. Williams was essentially offering her the chance to fight anyone who wanted to challenge her, with no restrictions except stopping short of permanent injury. Furthermore, Williams continued, "To make this fair, Recruit Martinez will face her challengers consecutively. No breaks, no rest periods between matches. If she defeats all challengers, this discussion ends permanently. If she fails, she'll be transferred to a different platoon, and you'll never see her again. The gymnasium erupted in whispered conversations as recruits realized what was being offered. This was Sarah's chance to prove herself definitively, but it was also potentially the end of her Marine Corps career if she failed. Williams turned to address Sarah directly. "Martinez, you don't have to do this. I can transfer you to another platoon tonight, and you can finish boot camp with a clean slate. No shame in that choice." Sarah looked around the gymnasium at the faces of her fellow recruits. Some looked eager for the challenge, others looked worried, and a few looked almost sympathetic. But she could see that this moment had been inevitable since her first day at Paris Island. "Sir, this recruit accepts the challenge, sir." Williams nodded approvingly. "Outstanding. Who wants to go first?" 5 hands went up immediately. Rodriguez stepped forward first, his face grim with determination. "I'll start, sir." Thompson was second. "I'm in." Davis, seeking redemption from their earlier encounter, was third. "Me too, sir." 2 other recruits Sarah didn't know well, Johnson and Stevens, also volunteered. Williams looked at the volunteers and then back at Sarah. 5 challengers, Martinez. You sure about this?" Sarah thought about her Uncle Roberto's garage, about all the hours of training, about the promise she had made to her father. She thought about every person who had ever told her she was too small, too weak, too female to succeed in a man's world. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." Williams called for the first match to begin, and as Rodriguez stepped onto the mat across from her, Sarah realized that the next 30 minutes would determine not just her future in the Marine Corps, but her place in the world. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she dreamed of becoming as a Marine came down to this moment. The whistle blew, and the fight for her future began. The gymnasium fell silent, except for the sound of 2 pairs of feet moving across the mat. Rodriguez circled Sarah like a predator, his muscles coiled and ready. At 190 pounds of solid muscle, he looked like he could break her in half without breaking a sweat. Sarah, at barely 93 pounds after 9 weeks of Marine Corps nutrition, looked like David facing not just Goliath, but his 4 brothers as well. But Sarah Martinez had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Rodriguez came in fast, throwing a combination of punches designed to overwhelm her with pure aggression. But Sarah had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She slipped the first punch, ducked under the second, and landed a sharp uppercut to Rodriguez's ribs that made him grunt in surprise. The fight was faster and more intense than any of their previous sparring matches. Rodriguez was fighting with everything he had, trying to end the match quickly before Sarah could find a rhythm. But Sarah was fighting with something more than skill or technique. She was fighting with the accumulated fury of every person who had ever told her she didn't belong. Sarah used Rodriguez's aggression against him, staying mobile and striking when he overextended. Her punches might not have carried knockout power, but they were precise and accumulative. After 2 minutes of intense action, Rodriguez was breathing hard and sporting a cut over his left eye. The turning point came when Rodriguez, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, lunged forward with a wild haymaker. Sarah stepped inside the punch, grabbed Rodriguez around the waist, and used a technique her Uncle Roberto had drilled into her thousands of times. She lifted Rodriguez off his feet and drove him into the mat with enough force to rattle the windows. Rodriguez hit the ground hard and didn't get back up. The medical staff checked him over and declared him unable to continue. 1 down, 4 to go. The gymnasium erupted in confused murmurs. Some recruits couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Others were beginning to realize that they might have seriously underestimated Sarah Martinez. Thompson stepped onto the mat without hesitation, but Sarah could see something different in his approach. He had learned from watching Rodriguez's defeat and wasn't going to make the same mistake of underestimating her. The second fight was more tactical. Thompson used his reach advantage to keep Sarah at distance, forcing her to work harder to get inside his guard. He was patient, disciplined, and clearly had a game plan for dealing with her speed and technique. For the first 90 seconds, Thompson controlled the pace of the fight. His jab kept Sarah at bay, and his footwork prevented her from getting the angles she needed to land her combinations. Sarah began to worry that she might have used too much energy in the first fight and wouldn't have enough left for 4 more opponents. But then Thompson made a critical error. Confident that he was winning the fight, he got aggressive and tried to finish Sarah with a flurry of punches. It was exactly the opening she needed. Sarah slipped under Thompson's guard and unleashed a combination to his body that doubled him over. As he bent forward, she grabbed his head and brought her knee up in a perfectly timed strike that sent Thompson crashing to the ground unconscious. 2 down, 3 to go. Davis approached the mat with visible reluctance. He had been confident about challenging Sarah when there were 5 of them, but watching 2 bigger, stronger recruits get demolished had clearly shaken his confidence. Still, he had volunteered, and backing down now would be humiliating. The third fight was the shortest yet. Davis was tentative, scared, and fighting not to win, but simply not to get hurt. Sarah sensed his fear and pressed her advantage immediately. She overwhelmed him with an aggressive combination that ended with Davis on his back, staring at the gymnasium lights and wondering what had just happened. 3 down, 2 to go. Johnson and Stevens looked at each other nervously as Sarah stood in the center of the mat, breathing hard but still clearly ready to continue. Both recruits were beginning to realize that they might have made a serious error in judgment when they volunteered for this challenge. Johnson stepped up fourth, and Sarah could see in his eyes that he was already beaten mentally. The fight lasted less than a minute before Johnson was joining his teammates on the sidelines, nursing a bruised ego and a split lip. 4 down, 1 to go. Stevens was the last challenger, and as he walked onto the mat, Sarah felt a moment of doubt. Not about her ability to defeat him. She was confident she could handle any individual opponent at this point, but about whether she would have enough energy left to finish the job. She had been fighting for nearly 8 minutes straight against increasingly desperate opponents, and her body was beginning to feel the accumulated effect of the punishment she had absorbed. Her ribs ached from the shots Rodriguez had landed. Her hands were swollen from delivering punishment, and she could taste blood in her mouth. But as Stevens settled into his fighting stance across from her, Sarah heard a voice from her past that gave her the strength to continue. It was her Uncle Roberto's voice, speaking to her from that garage in East L.A., where she had learned that heart was more important than size. Champions don't quit when they're tired, Mija. Champions quit when they're finished. Sarah wasn't finished. The final fight was a war of attrition. Stevens was smart enough to realize that Sarah might be running on fumes, and he tried to drag the fight out, hoping she would collapse from exhaustion. But what Stevens didn't understand was that Sarah Martinez had been fighting against exhaustion, poverty, and people's low expectations her entire life. She had learned to find strength when there was none left to find. The fight went on longer than any of the previous matches, with both fighters landing significant shots. Stevens managed to catch Sarah with a solid punch that sent her stumbling backward, and for a moment it looked like he might be able to capitalize on her fatigue. But Sarah gathered herself, dug deeper than she had ever dug before, and launched a final assault that left Stevens unconscious on the mat beside his 4 teammates. The gymnasium exploded into chaos. Recruits were on their feet cheering, drill instructors were shouting orders, and medical personnel were checking on the 5 defeated challengers. Through it all, Sarah stood in the center of the mat, swaying slightly from exhaustion, but still standing. Staff Sergeant Williams approached her with an expression of absolute amazement. "Martinez," he said, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "In 20 years of training Marines, I have never seen anything like what you just did. 5 opponents, 5 victories, and you're still standing." Sarah tried to respond, but found that she was too exhausted to speak. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fights was wearing off, and the full impact of what she had accomplished was beginning to sink in. Williams turned to address the entire platoon. "Let me make something crystal clear to all of you. What you just witnessed was not luck, it was not a fluke, and it was not because anyone was going easy on anyone else. What you witnessed was the difference between someone who has heart and someone who just has muscle." The silence in the gymnasium was absolute as Williams continued. "Recruit Martinez has just demonstrated more fighting spirit, more determination, and more pure warrior mentality than I've seen from any recruit in my entire career. She's exactly the kind of Marine this Corps needs, and any of you who can't recognize that don't deserve to wear the uniform. Over the following days, everything changed for Sarah. The hostility that had surrounded her for weeks evaporated overnight. Recruits who had barely spoken to her were now seeking her advice on everything from combat techniques to study habits. She had become something she never expected to be, a leader. Jackson was the first to approach her after the fights, his face red with embarrassment and genuine remorse. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time since boot camp began, "I owe you an apology that's about 3 weeks overdue. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to let the other guys treat you the way they did." Similar conversations happened throughout the week as recruit after recruit came to Sarah to apologize and ask for her forgiveness. She granted it freely, understanding that their behavior had come from fear and insecurity rather than genuine malice. The final weeks of boot camp passed quickly, with Sarah's performance remaining consistently excellent across all areas of training. But more importantly, Platoon 2156 had finally become a unified unit, with Sarah as one of its most respected members. The day before graduation, Staff Sergeant Williams called Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Martinez, I want you to know that what happened in that gymnasium was about more than just proving yourself to a bunch of insecure recruits. You demonstrated something that can't be taught in any manual or training program. You demonstrated the warrior spirit that defines what it means to be a Marine. Thank you, sir. I'm recommending you for advanced combat training after you complete Marine combat training. The Corps needs Marines like you in leadership positions, and I believe you have the potential to go as far as you want to go in this organization." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Sir, this recruit is honored by your confidence, sir. You've earned it, Martinez. Every bit of it." Graduation day dawned clear and beautiful, with families from across the country gathering to watch their children become United States Marines. Sarah's parents had driven all the way from Los Angeles to witness their daughter's transformation, and she could see the pride shining in their eyes as she marched in formation with her fellow Marines. When the ceremony concluded and she was finally able to embrace her family, Sarah's father pulled her aside for a private moment. "Mija, do you remember what I told you the night before you left? You told me not to let them break my spirit." Miguel Martinez smiled, his eyes wet with tears. "I was wrong, Mija. Your spirit doesn't need protecting. Your spirit is strong enough to lift up everyone around you." As Sarah looked around at her fellow Marines, many of whom had become genuine friends and supporters, she realized that her father was right. She hadn't just survived Marine Corps boot camp. She had transformed it, and it had transformed her. The scared little girl from East LA was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more determined than she had ever imagined possible. But the most important thing Sarah had learned wasn't about fighting or combat, or even about becoming a Marine. She had learned that sometimes the biggest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from earning the respect of people who started as your critics. Staff Sergeant Williams had been wrong about one thing, though. What happened in that gymnasium that night wasn't unprecedented. It was the continuation of a story that had begun years earlier in a garage in East Los Angeles, where a young girl learned that heart was more important than size. It was the story of Sarah Martinez, who refused to let anyone tell her where she belonged. And now, as a United States Marine, she belonged everywhere.